Hey everybody, welcome to Black Lotus Live, where we talk about all things strange and unusual. And tonight we have author Paul Wallis with us, and he's going to be talking about his series, the Eden series. He has Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden, and now he has just released Echoes of Eden. So, Paul, how are you?
G'day, I'm really well, thanks. On this side of the planet, how are you guys going?
It's hot.
Great.
We're going
Nothing
into
wrong with
winter.
that.
No, we're going into winter, so I like the heat. So
keep it on chat.
So, if you don't know, Paul's Eden series is all about ancient alien contact. And normally I open this with questions, but I'm not going to do that this time. I'm just going to shut up and let Paul explain what this is all about.
well, people know me today for that exact topic, paleocontact, the theory that in our deep past, our ancestors had contact with ET species, with other civilizations. And what often catches people by surprise is how I've reached this territory. And it's from a background in Christian ministry. I was 33 years in Christian ministry as a church doctor, a theological educator, training pastors in the interpretation of ancient texts, and as an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And it was really those tools of interpreting texts that got me down this rabbit hole into the topic of paleocontact. I had, in my preaching and teaching and training, made a mental note of various anomalies in the biblical stories that I kept promising myself I'm going to drill down into those at some point and work out what's really going on there. And so when I finally did have the time to do that, Escaping from Eden talks about an ultimate frisbee injury that I was convalescing for, which is a bit of a code for a number of times when the universe has gifted me with that kind of time and opportunity. And so I took my Bible translation skills with me, the source criticism I taught my pastors to do, form criticism I taught them to do, the linguistic question I'd always train them to ask, what do the words actually mean? And I applied them to these anomalous areas and realized that when you go back to the root meanings of various key words, an ET narrative opens up in plain sight in the Bible, just a translation away from being blindingly obvious. And Escaping from Eden really carries the reader on that journey of seeing what is actually in the texts of the Bible. And then when you read those texts according to the root meanings, suddenly you are reading the summary form of the ancient Mesopotamian texts, the cuneiform texts from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And those stories are very clearly not about God. They are about our ancestors' contact with extraterrestrial colonizers of our planet in the deep past. And once you've done that translation work, once you've read the texts that way, it is like Neo taking the red pill in the Matrix. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to the way you read it before because it doesn't make sense anymore.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, when you describe that the word angel actually translates to agent.
Yes.
It blew my
Yeah,
mind there. And you
it
start to
is.
think about it, and that's exactly what all these instances were. They were agents of whomever, God, the ETs or whomever, um, delivering a message.
Yes,
And
on
that,
assignment. That's right.
yeah, that was amazing.
Yes, the word angel doesn't denote anything about the biology or the genus or ontology of the thing. The word angel simply says something about their function, that they have a message, that they are on an assignment. An agent is quite a good rendition of it. And it's one of those words that gets used quite elastically in ancient texts, in the Hebrew and in the Greek very similarly. And very often stories that we've told as angelic stories turn out to be stories of close encounters.
I tried discussing it with a friend today, and immediately they started shutting down, and they're like, no, 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 no. I was like, no, no. It doesn't take away from Christianity. If anything, it opens it up to more
Right.
interpretations. It increases your Christianity. So, just
Oh,
take a look.
definitely.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that, Vicky. I was really excited as I was doing my research for the Eden series to go into early Christianity and primitive Christianity and discover that discussion of a populated universe and of other entities, ET entities in the text of the Bible, they were part of the mainstream conversation of Christianity in the beginning. And ongoing contact and remote communication experiences were all part of the Christian experience in the beginning. And it was only later that orthodoxy narrowed down and made a taboo of these kinds of topics.
Do you think they did that to kind of control the narrative and also to control the populace?
Absolutely. If you look in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament or the letter of 1 John, there you've got references to primitive Christian experience of people getting information from ancestral spirits and then spirits that are not identified. So he doesn't say whether these are ancestral or extraterrestrial, interdimensional, if they're energy-based beings, if they're physical beings like us who communicate telepathically. But he says that doesn't matter. As long as you keep your sovereignty and weigh up what you hear from these other entities, you're going to be getting some good information. Mm-hmm. Now, that was really studiedly ignored by Orthodox Christianity because that is an alternative source of information. And as the Romanesque Christianity, it wanted to create a world where you've got God and the emperor at the top, the bishops and the senators in the middle, and then the priests and the people at the bottom paying and praying, so to speak. They want a passive, easily managed public, and that feudalized kind of religion works very well. They felt, well, we can work with that. Any colonizing force, any government really wants full spectrum dominance over its territory. It wants to be the arbiter of what is history and what is fake history, what is news, what is fake news, what is true and what is false. And particularly when you've got something like the Roman Empire that's slowly taking on over the world, if the authorities say there was no massacre in that square on that day, then there was no massacre. They don't want other authorities running around giving alternative information, whether it's an independent priesthood of some religion over here, or if it's contact with interdimensional beings. It totally messes up their ability to control the narrative, to use your phrase.
Yes, exactly. I have one more thing and I'll be quiet. You had mentioned like John the Baptist and Jesus Christ and then several other people in the Bible who they had an angel come to them, or their parents did, and said, you're going to have a child. And they're like, oh, yeah, sure. And then all of a sudden they had a child when they weren't going to, when they logically, could not, or physically could not have one. Yeah. Then
well, that's
boom.
right. Now, these are familiar stories to Christian believers, and we think of the Christmas story. There's Mary, Joseph, the angel Gabriel, and then baby Jesus comes. And Christianity is often told that story as if it were a unique story, but it is not a unique story.
Mm-hmm.
Almost the same thing happened to Jesus's cousin and to Mary's cousin, Elizabeth. She couldn't have children because she was post-menopause, and then she has a close encounter with an entity, and we've already said angel doesn't mean what we think it means.
Right.
Some kind of non-human entity, and then following that close encounter, she's pregnant with an anomalously intelligent and conscious person called John the Baptist, whom Jesus described as the greatest human who ever lived.
And
so
even,
there are very similar stories there. And then not just them, of course, you go back into the Hebrew scriptures and you've got Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. The parents have a close encounter with three entities who are the sky people of the Sumerian stories, the Elohim of the biblical stories. Sarah is post-menopause. She's not going to have a child until she has a close encounter. And then she's pregnant with Isaac, and the beginning of history happens from that point on in the Bible. And it's further afield as well. You go to the story of Vipassi Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. You go to the story of the Yellow Emperor, the story of Lao Tzu. They are all the same story of women having close encounters, and they're often described as close encounters with phenomena of light coming from space and beaming down onto the mother's body, and then pregnancy, and then a very intelligent, significant, conscious person. And the story is even wider than that, because it's not just famous spiritual leaders who have these stories attached to them. There are women around the world today who carry these stories very secretively, very close to themselves. They don't go around boasting with these stories, but who would say something like, I have 4 children. The third one is the special one. Very intelligent, always advanced, very sensitive, psychic seeming abilities, knows things he couldn't possibly know. And yes, there was something anomalous about that conception. And they will tell a story similar to what we find in the biblical stories. So that places the story of Jesus in a whole family of narratives that represents part of the human experience that goes back thousands of years.
It makes sense to me.
Didn't mean to hijack it. Go ahead.
No, that's it. If you got good questions, go for it.
Good question.
Well, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. And even wasn't there like a painting in the 14th century that actually showed a UFO like object with a
there are many
coming down to Mary.
Yeah. But the picture I think you're referring to is the Carlo Crevelli picture of the Annunciation. Yes. Mm-hmm. And that is so interesting because there you do have, exactly as you described, Vicky, there's a flying saucer in the sky, what looks like a laser beam coming down from the craft into the jewelry that Mary's wearing around her head. That is nothing like how the written texts of Christianity describe the Annunciation, as it's known in Christianity. Mm-hmm. But it is exactly how those Eastern descriptions I mentioned from out of China describe the conception of a star child, as we would call them. Why did the painter choose that way of depicting the Annunciation when that's not what's in the Gospels? If you ask an art historian or an art critic, they will often say something like, oh, well, that's just an artistic convention for depicting these things, which is really not an answer at all, because you then have to ask why. Why is it a convention? Why have so many artists depicted it that way, if that's what you're telling me? And that in itself is a great white rabbit to follow. I think if we took our visual canon of art as seriously as we take our world's canon of literature, then some very different stories would emerge.
Yeah, it reminded me of a scene in Logans Run. I don't know if you remember that movie, with all these lasers and they would do the surgery on the face, and that's what it looked like, was a laser beam just shooting down. So anyway, okay, sorry.
And that was, I think it was the 1400s when that was painted, right. Long before we had invented laser beams. So, do the math.
Ah, yes.
Very strange. You were mentioning Mesopotamia, and one of the subjects that fascinates me so much are the Anunnaki. And I'd like to ask, why do you think that the Anunnaki left?
Oh, that's a really good question. My suspicion is that the Anunnaki of the Mesopotamian narratives colonized our planet in the deep past for similar reasons to which we invade and colonize each other's countries. I think they were here for something that the planet had to offer them, whether it was minerals or something to do with the properties of the planet. And they were here for a while, benefiting from the resources our planet had to offer. And then they went home, except the picture might be a little bit more complex than that, because if you think about how we go into each other's countries, what we tend to do is we go in with force and we stay there for a while, physically present. In fact, we will overwhelm the country with our physical military presence. So there's no question we've taken over the country. Now we are appointing the head of state. We are the police. We are the law. We are the legal system, the judges, the teachers. We create the post office. We set up the stock exchange. And we enjoy sitting at the top of the economic tree of that territory we've just taken. But after a while, we can relax a bit. Let's appoint some locals as school teachers. Let's let some locals become bishops and teachers and public servants. And then once you've done that and you set the commodity prices and you set the exchange rates and you set up the banking system in relationship to your own, you don't have to stay anymore. You can go home and still enjoy the benefits of sitting at the top of the economic tree. This is how we do it. We go in, we do these things, and then we can leave, except our presence is still felt through these systems. And I wonder if that's similar to the Anunnaki being with us for a while, and then going off planet again. That is the pattern reflected in the Hebrew stories, where we have a period where clearly human colonies were governed by non-human entities that were very terrifying, and they're often described in very draconian terms. And then by the time you get to King David in the Old Testament, and the story moves on from there, you're in a situation where the powerful ones, the Elohim of the Bible, are no longer visible and present. And the job of the priests and kings is to achieve remote communication in order to get the kind of guidance and information that their powerful ones used to provide. And so the priests now take on this intermediary role, and that's what the prophets are employed to do. And that's why you have strange technology like the Ark of the Covenant and the Urim and the Thummim to get the remote communication going, because the powerful ones are no longer on the planet's surface.
Do you think that excuse me, do you think that they created us with their own DNA?
I think we are the result of a number of interventions in the evolution of life on Earth. And the Anunnaki stories from Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria do speak about a fusion of the DNA, to use the modern term, the DNA of the colonizers, the Anunnaki, with the DNA of the primates, our ancestors who are already here. And that echoes in the story of the Bible, where you've got the clay that's formed from what's on earth, and then the breath of the powerful ones put into that, the consciousness. And then you go to the Mesoamerican stories, and you've got the same thing, that the final stage in producing Homo sapiens, or the last but one actually, is where you've got something of the DNA of the visiting species fused with the earthlings, the primates, our ancestors. And in fact, there are narratives all around the world that speak about human beings being abducted for the purposes of hybridization. And in many of those stories, the hybridization is actually to benefit the visitors. They want some of what we have in their gene pool. But that's all part of thousands of years of indigenous story that talk about humans as hybrids of Earthling plus a bit of ET. That's how I would read those ancient stories. And when I did the translation work, to my astonishment, I found that is the story of the Bible as well.
Sweet.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, honestly. I think that it was like Victoria was saying, it opens up Christianity to another level. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
That's exactly right. I mean, in the very first thing it does is it expands your vision of God. So all of a sudden, instead of this tiny little universe with God and his special creation, Homo sapiens, and then an empty universe, now you've got a populated universe. And the creator's been far busier than you thought. And that's just the beginning of that opening up of the process, because it does reframe your understanding of God and who we are and how you interpret stories like the stories of Jesus. And it does blow it wide open in a way that echoes how Christianity was in the beginning, when it was a kaleidoscope of experiences and encounters and theologies. And I have been so excited to rediscover that aspect of the story. Many of the early church fathers read the Hebrew scriptures in the way I do. And they did that because half a millennium before, the great writer Plato, the Greek philosopher, was writing about paleocontact. He taught that our species was adapted and modified for higher consciousness and higher intelligence by visitors from elsewhere in the cosmos. And church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Marcion, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr were absolutely immersed in the world of Plato, and they saw the world through that lens. And they didn't find it hard to recognize that pattern of a story in the Hebrew scriptures. And it was why they argued that we shouldn't read the Elohim stories as God's stories. We should recognize them as stories of other kinds of entity.
Do you think that's why the Vatican has such a magnificent observatory and they're always looking to the heavens?
It does indeed have a magnificent observatory and some very great minds associated with it. And if you listen to the director of the observatory, Father Gabriel Funes, Jose Gabriel Funes, or to the senior astronomer, the Reverend Guy Consolmagno, they have spoken very openly about the need for us to be ready to meet and embrace a brother or sister alien. That's their language. And to recognize that we're part of a wider cosmic family. And Guy Consolmagno went as far as to say we shouldn't be surprised to meet them because they are in the Bible, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Now, he said that back in 2009. And when he said that, I thought, really? Could I have missed something as glaringly strange as aliens in the Bible through all my years of preaching on it? And it was like a gauntlet thrown down to the theologians of the world to go back to the texts and look again at what's happening there. And it was one of the things that gave me the impulse to do the work that led to Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, and now Echoes of Eden.
Paul, I want to thank you for coming on. It's always so enjoyable to listen to you speak. And I have a question as well. So you've illustrated a lot about our ET past, the convoluted nature of it. So I'm curious about, what do you recommend we do about our ET future? I mean, what should we do as individuals and as a whole society? Should we not do anything? Should we try to change our behavior? Should we try to contact them? What's your opinion for how to move forward?
Well, I would go back to the advice of the author of 1 John in the New Testament, and that is to expect to be in contact. he fully expected the early Christians to be getting communication from other entities. Now, he uses the word spirit, and that can throw people off, but he doesn't say what he means by spirit. In some languages, spirit is not an ethereal, bodiless, formless entity wafting through the ether. If you go to Papua New Guinea, a moon spirit was an entity, physical entity that looked like a gecko. That should get some minds whirring.
Yeah.
So you go to that text and he's saying there are other entities out there who will want to be in communication with you. Expect communication, but keep your own sovereignty, weigh up what you hear, decide for yourself if you want to do anything about it or not. And that for him was part of the experience of being an alive, awake human being. And I would say the same. If you then go to Hebrews, that writer expected you to be in contact interdimensionally with the consciousness of ancestors. And he doesn't say exactly how, but just that there is something different about our dimensionality from what you or I might learn in school. And so to go to your question, I would say there are people all around the world having that 1 John 4 experience right now. And I often, when I'm coaching people, I often refer to those two texts and I say something like this: I have come to believe that every one of us has a little cloud of helpers. That's the language from Hebrews, where the writer says, since we're each surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, a witness is someone who's watching you, and they're very interested in your life and your progress and how we're running the race. And when I say to my coachees, I'm coming to believe we each have an invisible team around us, supporting us and helping us, I've yet to say that to someone who hasn't said, I'm coming to believe the same thing, because they're beginning to recognize little nudges, thoughts, synchronicities that suggest they do have some kind of support going on. When you go to people who are very aware that they've had a close encounter and listen to their description of what happened, a proportion of those experiences are disturbing and terrifying, but another proportion are of experiences where the person felt they were getting information, a download of information, or they come back from the encounter and they have information they didn't have before. And sometimes there are conversations which are to do with supporting our lives on this planet. If you listen to the children who had the close encounter of the fourth kind in Rua, in Zimbabwe, at Ariel School. So these are young children who en masse saw craft come down and interacted with beings who came out of those craft. And I loved the innocence with which they described that encounter. They were interviewed on television very shortly afterwards. John Mack, Harvard's head of clinical psychology, went and interviewed them, and you can watch the footage. James Fox has this footage in his movie, The Phenomenon.
Yep.
And there's a girl in it who's being asked to describe the encounter, and she says, he was about the size of a year 6. And I just love the innocence of that description. And then as an adult, she told a friend of mine exactly what happened when she encountered this entity. She said, I couldn't move, and I could tell that information was being downloaded into me through my eyes, and I had this splitting headache after the experience. And my friend Lionel Friedberg, asked her, well, what was the communication about? And she said, I think they're concerned about what we're doing to the planet and how we're living on the planet. They're concerned that we should be able to survive and live in harmony with the plants and the animals and the planet as a whole. And that is a supportive conversation. The earliest accounts of contact in ancestral narratives around the world are of conversations like that. So you listen to stories from among the Cherokee people, for instance. They will talk about a time in the deep past when their ancestors were visited by people who came from the Pleiades and spent some time sitting with their ancestors, teaching them how to live in balance with the planet, what plants were good for food and which ones were good to avoid, which were good for medicine, which were good for higher consciousness. So these are supportive conversations. The Babylonian story of Oannes and the Apkallu speak of beings coming and teaching our ancestors all the accoutrements of living as a civilization on planet Earth: civil engineering, medicine, literature, sanitation, legal systems, money, a supportive conversation. And so just as there was that kind of conversation in the past, when you come to writers like the writer of 1 John 4, he's expecting that those supportive relationships are ongoing. And the more I'm contacted by people around the world, the more I believe that's the case here. So in terms of disclosure, sometimes I think it's a fool's errand to sit waiting for governments to come clean about being in contact. We don't really need that when thousands and maybe millions of us around the world are already in contact.
Two things real quick. One, I want to say hi to Rich from GoofOn. He's in here joining us today. And second, I don't remember who asked, but it was a good question. It was, who created the aliens? If this is possible, then who created the aliens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I was 11 years old, I remember reading Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken, and I felt he'd really put his finger on a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as a conscious, intelligent species. And he repeated what Plato said, that it made sense. It would make more sense if there'd been an intervention in our story to upgrade us. Now, as an 11-year-old, I was fascinated by this, but immediately realized that pushes the question you've just asked simply onto another planet. Except the picture is even more layered than that. Back in the 60s, Francis Crick was the co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA. And from the get-go, he argued that the evolution of life as we know it on planet Earth only makes sense with a timeline that puts the beginning of that story off planet, because our planet isn't old enough for it all to have happened here. And so from the beginning, he argued that the source of life was deep in the cosmos and arrived on planet Earth. When he said that, he was repeating what Plato had argued 2,500 years before. It's the theory of panspermia. And the theory is that the genetic coding for biological, intelligent, conscious life has been spread throughout the cosmos, that life is the norm in the cosmos rather than the exception, that it's part of the cosmos, and that whenever this genetic coding lands in an hospitable environment, which means a planet with water, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones we're familiar with. So we're looking at a populated universe where all life in the cosmos has this same source, this genetic coding that is part of the structure of the cosmos from the beginning. And so if a planet is seeded ahead of ours, then there's the possibility of a more advanced species arising, who can then travel, who can then come and visit their neighbors, relatives, and intervene in their stories. And that's the picture that is believed in by Francis Crick and many leading scientists in the field of DNA research. They hold to panspermia. That was the belief of Carl Sagan, who wrote extensively about it in the 1960s. But it's there in our ancestral narratives as well, that talk about life arriving on the planet in seed form. The Zulu story of Unkulunkulu would be a wonderfully cinematic version of that story, where the life forms of Africa arrived on the African plains in pods and then developed here. And they have this wonderful way of telling the story that life originated in the cosmos, arrived here, and then developed here, and then was adapted here.
Right. You know, I mean, you're talking about the start of the universe, what, 14 billion years ago. I think human beings have such a limited capability to understand how long that is and how many civilizations likely developed before us. And
Oh,
so,
yes.
yeah, and so that leads me to another question, Paul, and that's your fellow Christians. How do they receive this?
Well, I get a spectrum of responses, but I've been overwhelmed by how positive the response has been. I was really preparing myself for a lot of flack when I published the first in the series, Escaping from Eden. And I've had plenty of people contacting me saying this is, you're debunking the Bible, this is demonic deceit, you're luring people to the pit of hell, one writer wrote to me recently. And I have to reply as politely as I can and say, no, my agenda is not to debunk the Bible. My agenda is to understand the Bible.
Mhm.
And this has not blown up my faith in Jesus or my following of Jesus or my concept of God. Not at all. It's enriched it. And for the most part, I can get into a conversation with people. 90% of the time, if I'm responding to an aggressive comment on YouTube, on the Fifth Kind TV, or on the Paul Wallis channel, 90% of the time, we only have to have a couple of exchanges of comments and we are understanding each other. There are a few who, because it's a taboo, are offended as soon as I speak the word ET. But for the most part, the response I've had is from people of faith, pastors, theologians who have said, thank you for putting this on the table. Thank you, because I've always seen this in the texts and in my church I'm not allowed to talk about it. Or thank you because I had a close encounter and I mentioned it to my pastor and he told me never to mention it again. Or thank you because I've been pastoring people who've had close encounters and my bishop has told me never to mention it to him again. So there are people out there who want to talk about these things, want to explore these things, are aware of them, and are very grateful for a book that gives them permission to have the discussion, because they can give the book to someone else and say, what do you think about that? And it's often a way that that's often the way that thought advances in more academic circles. It's very rare that a tenured professor will come forward and say, what all my colleagues in the field believe is rubbish. I've now realized A, B, and C. People want to keep their friends. People want to maintain tenure. And so that's not the pattern. The pattern is that a writer, someone like me, joins the dots, writes a book, and then the academics say, oh, let's talk about this crazy book, this crazy Paul Wallis has written, and see what we think. And then one or two of them might say, well, he actually has a strong point there. And that's how the conversation moves forwards. And as a writer, you have to be prepared to occupy that space where you're going to get that flack, you're going to get that knee-jerk reaction, but there'll be some out there saying, oh no, there's something here, and let's talk about this.
Cool.
I've always looked at the Bible kind of like a history book of the different species that were here.
Oh, it's certainly that. And there really is a great spectrum of entities described in the Hebrew scriptures in particular, and descriptions that echo in ancestral narratives of other cultures all around the world. And once you open your eyes to the possibility that the word Elohim might not mean God, that it might be a reference to powerful ones of all different kinds, that then leads you to the Sky Council stories, which are then very obviously about different kinds of entity with a stakeholding in Project Earth. And again, you can't unsee that. You've got stories of energy-based archonic beings who are interfering in the geopolitics of the planet. You've got stories of reptilian dragon-like entities who are marshalling human populations for their own pleasure. And then you've got stories of entities who would appear to be very beautiful human-like beings, all part of the stories. once you recognize that spectrum, it suddenly makes sense that you've got the 10 Commandments beginning with a command to disregard all the other entities and to forget about them. Don't talk about them, don't paint them, don't carve them, don't depict them, and certainly don't work for them. You serve Yahweh and Yahweh only. That's the beginning of the 10 Commandments, an acknowledgement of other entities. And then that acknowledgement from Moses is repeated by a successor, Joshua, who says, don't work for the powerful ones of the Egyptians or the powerful ones your ancestors served in Mesopotamia. Work for Yahweh only. There's an acknowledgement of other powerful ones, other entities. Yahweh's just one of them, but he's the one we're going to serve. Now that's called henotheism, an acknowledgement of a spectrum of powerful entities, but you serve just the one. And for almost all its history, the Hebrew canon were stories told in a henotheistic world. And it was only in the 6th century BCE that those stories were edited and redacted into the form we have today to teach monotheism and to try and airbrush over the reality of these other entities. But the shape of the old stories remains so that you can't miss it.
Awesome. I had another question
the
about...
story.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Kim, go ahead. I'll ask after you. It's fine.
Okay. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's wife. Number one, they would have had. They did not have that kind of technology back then, and I said that I believe it was the fighting between different species for that area, as well as far as because to mend down to the thickness with the thickness of what was melted to make glass, you needed at least, I believe it's 3,600 degrees. The technology they didn't have back then. So to me, that had to have been advanced technology and other species here to have that happen, as well as Lot's wife being vaporized and turned to a pillar of salt. Again, that's technology that would not have been at that time.
That's absolutely correct. And that's one of a number of examples where technology is described to us in the ancient stories. We, with 21st century references, can say exactly what you just said, Kim, that we recognize a vaporization when it's described. We recognize a thermonuclear attack when we see it. We recognize a wormhole. We recognize a rocket launch. We recognize remote communication. In the past, before our ancestors had developed the kind of technology that we're all familiar with, they didn't have that framework when it came to translating the texts. But what's amazing is that you can go back to the Hebrew texts, and they have been curated with such fidelity, even with all the redactions. The language is still there. And so we can find a word like kavod, which means craft, or ekye, which means life form, or tub, which means equipment. What's another thing? I think kavod is a big heavy thing. Pane. These are all words that occur in a moment where Moses witnesses a rocket launch. And when you and I read it in the Hebrew, it's fairly clear that's what's happening. When Yahweh says you can't be in the open when the big heavy thing launches or it will kill you. You'll have to be sheltered in a cleft in the rock. Now, I watched the Space Shuttle Discovery launch, and we had to be several miles away from that to be safe. The nearest technicians were 3 miles away behind reinforced concrete. It all makes perfect sense when I see that described. But if someone's translating that, let's say in 1611, to produce the King James Bible, they don't have the technological framework, and so they translate it in spiritual terms. And they believe it must be a spiritual phenomenon that's being described. But it produces texts that don't quite make sense. And that rocket launch that Moses witnesses is one of them. I won't go into detail because I do that in Scars of Eden. And it's one of those texts that any person reading the Bible will just go, what? At the end of it, because it's not lining up, it's not coherent, it's not making sense. Go to the root meanings of the words, and the technological nature of those moments becomes crystal clear.
Same with Jacob's ladder.
Yes, that's right. I mean, what is that? It's something that he describes as a ladder. That's the technology he knows. Well, what's a ladder? It allows you to get from low down to high up. And he's seeing powerful ones coming from out of the sky down to the surface and then back up to the sky. You and I might use a different metaphor to describe that. And we have a few portal, wormhole type experiences in the Hebrew scriptures where we would reach for those words. Jacob says it was a ladder. If you go to the Nigerian story of Osanabuwa, they talk about a chain, that the Almighty One above the waters descended from space on what looked like a chain and then began
something for
rehabilitating
elevation.
the planet. Yeah, from the sky to the earth, and they just use the technology that they have to describe what they're seeing. Ancient Nigerians
their
said
vocabulary was limited.
Yeah, that's right. And then the Hebrews said a ladder, and we would say portal, wormhole.
My question was about biology. So let's assume, like you described, that life on this planet was seeded. So perhaps that means a single-celled organism, something like that, was brought here. So what if the people, the biological beings that brought that life here, is it possible that they also are the product of another species seeding their planet? And is it possible it keeps going back that way? It is just a matter of time. What do you think about this idea?
Yes, I think that's very valid. I would suggest that's what Carl Sagan believed, because that's what he put in his book. The one novel he wrote, which became the movie Contact, suggested this very long relay, such as you're describing there. Carl Sagan's fascinating because he did present himself as a very scientifically minded person. He wasn't one for flying kites and speculating. He really wanted to stick to what the data would support. And yet, he's the guy who briefed Alan Shepard, Ed Mitchell, and Stuart Noosa on what the code word was to use if they found themselves in company with extraterrestrials on the way to the moon, on the moon's surface, or on the way back. So he was involved in that way. And I can tell you, it takes a lot to write a novel. You only write a novel about something you're passionate about. He founded SETI, which just really, I think, put that marker out there of saying this universe cannot be unpopulated. And then he wrote a book that says, we've been in contact, we've been adapted and helped. This is the way life has evolved through the cosmos throughout the ages. And I suspect that he said in story form what he felt he couldn't present as science, what he couldn't present as fact. And yes, it makes perfect sense. We would not be the only species to have been helped along by cosmic neighbors.
Didn't he eventually rescind his comments about aliens?
Not exactly. In the 1960s, he was very enthusiastic about the study of ancestral narratives, which is my turf. Very enthusiastic about the theory of panspermia, was part of driving the conversation forward about paleocontact. And then he went quiet on that. And by the time Eric von Daniken was really charting with Chariots of the Gods and was quoting Carl Sagan's work in that book, Carl Sagan felt he had to distance himself from his old comments. He was now in the world of, tenured professors, so on and so forth, and he just didn't want to run on a paleocontact ticket. And so he did the scientific thing, and he was a brilliant mind, and he's a great hero to people for that reason. But I think his commitment to SETI and then his writing of the novel tell you there was another layer to him as well. And no one invests into something like a novel that becomes Contact without thinking that's something very deep, that's something motivated him very deeply. And it is the same as his early beliefs. So I think that is a little subtext to the life and teaching of Carl Sagan. That's what I argue for in Escaping from Eden.
I see. Let's talk about your new book. How do you transcend into Echoes of Eden?
Well, by the time I got to the end of Escaping from Eden, I realized that as soon as you're talking about human origins, you're also talking about human potential, because you're looking at who we are and where we came from. And many of the ancestral narratives from all around the world that talk about our being adapted by ET visitors have a narrative that in which we are upgraded, and then the last step is a downgrade to bring us to a point where we're easily managed. So that downgrade is referenced in Genesis 11. It's in the story of Zeus and Prometheus. It's in the story of the Popol Vuh. And it's in the Nigerian story of Abasi and Atai. The Popol Vuh is a really interesting example because it talks about the final stage of our development. And this is the Mayan story of human origins. It's very frank about the difficulties that our visitors had in finessing Homo sapiens. It was a long process of adaptation, development, until they fused some of their own DNA with ours and produced a Homo sapiens that was even more advanced than us. That was us plus better precognition, better remote viewing, better telepathic connection, better self-healing. And they found it was very difficult to use that species as a working class. We were just too smart to be managed that way. And so this is the Mayan story. They hold an emergency meeting. How can we dial these down a bit, these human beings, to a point where they're willing to work for us? And the answer produced by Cucumatz, who's also known as Quetzalcoatl, and Kukulkan, was to create a vapor that when sprayed over human populations would brain damage us, dial down our higher cognitive abilities to the point where we're limited to a perceptual field that gives us information about what's immediately around us and nothing else. And for anything else, we'll have to rely on an authority to tell us what's what. And they found they could work with that. Now, what's intriguing about that story is that to dial us down, they didn't change our DNA. They dialed us down by something external in the environment. The Nigerians tell the same story, that Abasi and Atai also overshot, produced a human species that was too advanced, so they released devices into the environment which through toxins would make us anxious and ill and more easily managed. Now, those narratives suggest that in our DNA, these higher capacities are still present, but in the off position. Neuroscientists around the world study a real-world phenomenon called acquired savant syndrome, which is where a person will have a brain injury, a stroke, they'll be in a coma, they'll be in an accident, a central nervous system event, and then when they recover, they have higher cognitive abilities. They are more conscious, more intelligent. They can do higher mathematics, advanced physics. They can play a musical instrument they couldn't play before, speak a language they couldn't speak before. And it's absolutely mystifying. And these neuroscientists are very open about the mystery of it. They say it suggests we all have these abilities latent in our brains, but in the off position. But they can be knocked on by accident. Now, this is totally counterintuitive. A brain injury should diminish your abilities, not extend them. But when you put that alongside the ancestral narratives, it makes perfect sense. Our ancestors were more advanced. And we have the potential to be more advanced as well. And it explains why those cultures that have curated the stories have also curated shamanic and mystical modalities designed to switch those bits of the brain back on, to get better telepathic connection rolling again, to get remote viewing rolling again, to get better self-healing happening again. And this is where I've gone in Echoes of Eden. Because the moment you start listening with an open ear to world mythology and ancestral narratives, you realize that the themes of paleocontact and unlocking higher potential are absolutely intertwined. You can't read those stories without reading about human beings unlocking their higher abilities. And so Echoes of Eden goes to the indigenous cultures of the world, sits at the feet of the guardians of those traditions and traditional healers, and listens for the information that's passed on through initiation cultures, because that's where all this information has resided. We talked earlier about empires controlling the narrative. That doesn't mean that the old stories vanish. They're just pushed down to the grassroots. And that's where stories of paleocontact and human potential have survived. Echoes of Eden goes there and unpacks all of that.
I really liked what you had to say about how alien contact, people who have experienced the fourth kind, like myself, they come back from it more aware of the world, and so I liked what you had to say about how they're concerned about us, and rightfully so, I think. When my experience happened in 1988, I didn't remember until 1995, but in 1988, I remember that's when my whole world consciousness changed. I started caring about people. I started caring about the world, and so I think that that's very right. I think that that's, well, if not the main reason, one of the main reasons why they're here,
Yes, with some of them, I think that is definitely the case. And I want to pick up on a detail of your story there, which is really remarkable. 1988, you had your experience. 1995, you remembered it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can really relate to that, because when I published Escaping from Eden, people started contacting me for coaching, but they were very tentative about opening up, and they wanted to test me to see if I was really trustworthy with their story of a close encounter. And one of the ways they would test me was by asking, Paul, have you ever experienced a close encounter? And early on, my answer was no, I haven't, but I know many people who have. But as I listened to more and more stories, the more I started thinking, wait a minute, that thing that happened when I was 20, in fact, those 5 strange encounters I had when I was 20, I think those were close encounters. I had tried to interpret them at the time through a theological framework. And my theological framework had only a very few boxes of beings to tick. I had space for God, the devil, angels, demons, humans, animal, vegetable, mineral, and nothing else. But my experiences didn't really fit in those boxes. So I tried to squeeze a couple into the demonic box, thinking, well, that must have been a demonic encounter because it was scary. That must have been an angelic encounter because it felt really elevating. Now looking back, I realized, no, those are not the right boxes at all. My anomalous experiences were of extraterrestrial entities, some that I now believe were small greys, and some that looked completely human, and some that were interdimensional, and here's an experience of lost time. So here I am, more than 30 years later, remembering what happened and re-understanding it. And a lot of people I coach are in that kind of a position where they haven't had the opportunity to process an experience they've had that they've never understood. And in Scars of Eden, I encourage people to share their own stories of the strange and anomalous. Because if we would allow ourselves permission to say, there's something that happened to me years ago. I've never understood it. I've never got my head around it. I can only remember the first few seconds of it. And this is what it was. If we will let each other share those stories without fear of ridicule, we can begin putting those stories together and a bigger picture will emerge. And the bigger picture is that we are not alone.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of like that's kind of like where I, with my experience with the ETs as well. I believe that because they take something from us, they give something in return. It's a balance.
I think very often that is the case. I do know some people have experiences that they just find harrowing and terrorizing. But the more people I speak to, the more I feel that's actually quite a small proportion of the overall contact experience. And the moment we include in our discussion experience of interdimensional communication, I think it's overwhelmingly positive contact that we're experiencing. And it is to do with nurturing us as individuals and as a species with a sustainable presence on planet Earth.
I think it's got to do with just whatever you can recall too. You know, like I had a good experience the times that I went, but the thing that I don't recall is the exams. So if I would have recalled the exams, I probably wouldn't be saying that. Whereas Damien had bad experiences, and that makes me feel bad too, because of the good ones that I had.
Yes.
Well, the thing is, with my experience, I mean, yeah, being on the exam table was pretty terrifying. But I don't want to say that the entire experience was bad. I didn't remember what happened on the exam table until just maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. And prior to that, I thought it was just a very interesting experience that I went through. And I mean, aside from being on the exam table, I mean, it's like you said, Paul, they were giving me information, you know, and so I think that that's why my worldview changed at that time. And
I'd like to open up the possibility that we may have had experiences which have always puzzled us, that we didn't ever consider the possibility they were ET encounters because they were encounters with people who looked entirely human.
Wow.
But you go back to the experience and you think, no, there was something so odd and something so off about that encounter, that interaction. It's never made sense to me. And I think some of those experiences are close encounter experiences as well that are far more easily missed than the kind of experiences we've just been discussing.
right.
Wow. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. I think we're going to get out of here for the night. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
It's been a great pleasure.
I just recently saw that you're going to be on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. When is that happening?
Oh, yes, that's right. I think it's May the wee small hours of May the 4th, if I remember correctly.
Oh, awesome.
I think it's up. It's dated as the May the 3rd show, but it's actually the wee small hours of May the 4th. I'm pretty sure that's correct. George Norrie, I love going on Coast to Coast. It's a really exciting experience. And George Norrie has actually endorsed Echoes of Eden. I'll just read what he said. He said, Paul has done it again with his Eden series, delving deep into the power of the mind to do incredible things. So I'm very grateful to George for that comment. That really is what Echoes of Eden is about. And I'm looking forward to discussing it with him.
He and Art Bell are...
Oh, yeah.
They were my inspiration to develop Black Lotus. You know, they really were.
Wonderful.
And
so, yeah,
I loved Art Bell, and I still love George Norrie. But viewers, thanks a lot for watching. If you're interested in this topic, I highly encourage you to go to Paul Wallis's page on Amazon, and I've got that listed in the link listed in the description, as well as his podcast here on YouTube. So
But
definitely check that
that's
out.
The Fifth Kind TV is my main channel, the Fifth Kind TV. And I do have a second channel as well, the Paul Wallis channel. And I'm always there in the comments if people want to get into conversation with me.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Nice.
That's great. Again, Paul, thank you so much for being here. Viewers, thanks for watching as always. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the little bell so you get notified. And please, if you have friends that are into these topics that we talk about here, share it with them. Share them to your groups of Facebook. So anyway, until next time, keep thinking and question everything.